It's Friday, Geeks, and you are watching another edition of the Friday Night Geek Show. I am Dante D, and welcome to the channel where we talk about comic books and other geek stuff. So this week, I am actually flying solo, and I'm actually really excited about this opportunity. We've had a guest pretty much every single week since we started the show, but I decided to actually go solo this week, and I'm actually excited for this opportunity just because I'm probably going to get a little bit more of an opportunity to interact with you folks. I know a lot of times it can be difficult to address all comments as they're coming through when you're in the middle of a conversation with different guests, so on and so forth. So look forward to talking to you all a little bit more this week. So let the comments fly in because I definitely will be addressing them as they come in. This week, I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite topics actually in comic books. If you've been following the channel for a while, you probably know that I am a huge aficionado of comic book history. I love all history, but I especially love comic book history. So we're going to kind of be taking a nice little stroll through comic book history, starting with the very first comic books that appeared in the 1930s, all the way to present day, because the landscape of comic books has changed quite a bit in over 80 years, as it would naturally. I mean, nothing would stay the same for 80 years, naturally, right? So let's start off with how comic books all began. Contrary to popular opinion and popular belief, comic books, the very first comic books actually didn't actually appear in the 1930s. The comic book medium did exist prior to the 1930s. Actually, it even existed even as far back as the 1800s, but they didn't really look like the comic books we know today. Heck, you could even argue that comic books existed thousands and thousands of years ago with those first cave paintings that you saw in Europe. Now, mind you, they didn't have words, but what is a comic book? It's just pictures and words, right? Before I keep going, Vincent McLean, the Comic Machine, welcome. I see there are quite a few people. There are a few people watching right now. So if you are here right now, let me know. Would love to hear from you. We are talking comic book history tonight. So going back to the very first comic book. So like I said, the medium existed, but in the 1930s, the comic book medium was pretty much limited to newspapers. If you were a comic book creator in the 1930s, newspapers is where you wanted to be. That's where the money was. That's where the readership was. That's where the recognition was. Comic books did exist, like the actual books. However, they were just reprints of content that you saw in newspapers. So comic book creators at the time thought it would be a great way to recycle some old content and make money from it. And it was a really cheap way to repackage comic books. They almost were the first trade paperbacks ever to hit the stands. So those were just reprints. But eventually, we did start seeing comic books with all new original stories. And the pioneers of the comic book as we know it were Max Gaines. For those of you who don't know who Max Gaines is, he was actually the father of William Gaines, who eventually became the publisher of the infamous EC Comics. And then there was also a gentleman known who went by the name Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson. And a couple weeks ago, we had Athena Finger on, and she's the granddaughter of co-creator of Batman, Bill Finger, and she was talking about how Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson's grandchildren and great-grandchildren are still quite involved in the comic book community. Just wanted to welcome some other people who are coming on in now. We have Rob. He says, I grew up collecting during the Bronze Era in the 70s. Yeah, I would really have to say that is probably one of my favorite eras in comic books, 70s and 80s. That's definitely where it's at for me. And Jesse Lynch, welcome, saying, hi, guys, just reading Golden Age of DC Comics. Okay, perfect. So you are really going to love what we're going to be talking about tonight, because we're going to be spending quite a bit of time talking about the Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze Age, all the way up to today. So we were talking about Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson, Max Gaines. So these guys had some really, they had the great idea of publishing comic books with all new stories. You know, they thought that would be a great idea, and maybe to make some money. The first books that they published were, Famous Funnies. If any of you know Famous Funnies, that's actually a very highly collectible comic from the Golden Age of comics. But then something huge happened in 1938. Anybody want to wager what happened in 1938? Well, I won't wait, because there's a little bit of a delay in me getting the messages on the forum here. But that is Action Comics #1, which, of course, is the first appearance of Superman. Victor Perez, welcome. Is this Javier? I'm sorry, I can't really say your name. If you could maybe spell it out phonetically, that would be great, because I'm sorry if I butchered your name. And let's see here. Yeah, there we go. And then everyone's responding to my my question. It is Superman. That was the thing that happened in 1938. So we're talking about Superman, 1938. Believe it or not, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, who were the creators of Superman, they actually didn't want to publish Superman in a comic book. They were two young, poor Jewish kids from Cleveland, Ohio. And what they wanted for themselves was to see Superman published in a daily newspaper strip. They sent their idea to newspaper syndicates all across the country. And of course, their idea got rejected. Why? Well, at the time, there was a lot of anti-Semitism going around, but also they were young. So at the time, if you were young, you were Jewish, it really kind of was hard to get into that type of business. So eventually, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, they got in touch with National Allied Publications, which at the time was the name for DC Comics, and they decided to give them a shot, because National Allied Publications was still a relatively new company, and to get their business going, they needed their content to come cheap. So they basically gave these two kids a shot. And the popularity of Superman just exploded. This character was unlike anything that anyone had seen before. Jesse Lynch, let's see here. Slam Bradley. I know that name. You're going to have to explain to me. I've heard this name before. I know this is some sort of Golden Age character, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit about Slam Bradley. Nicholas 086, welcome, first of all. Who was Superman's villains back in the late 1930s into the 1940s? That is actually a really great question. Superman didn't really have any. I mean, Lex Luthor did make an appearance in the early issues of Action Comics, but Superman really didn't have any big baddies. There really weren't any big baddies back then as we know them today. Big baddies today, we know them as characters that are worthy of carrying on this huge arc of huge story arc, huge comic book story, so it could be printed in trade paperbacks. Back then, Superman's villains were just street thugs. Really, it's really interesting, because the world that you see Superman in those early issues of Action Comics really reflected the world of Depression era America. These were real problems that Superman was dealing with in those early issues of Action Comics. He was dealing with wife beaters, with people who were taking advantage of, like investors who were taking advantage of poor countries in South America. Like that first issue of Action Comics #1, stories were very crude. They weren't really, the art is even pretty crude. I mean, I'm sure all of us watching who are here tonight probably could draw like that. But, you know, they were really to the point. And these stories were, they were just, you know, this happens, and done. That was the early Superman stories. So to answer that question, no, he didn't really have any big baddies at the time. But then as America started getting into the war, the big baddies eventually became the Nazis and the Japanese. Once America, well, actually, it was a little bit before America even entered the war. Superheroes went to war actually before America. They went to war with great gusto. Sorry, I can't talk tonight. All right, Daniel Frerix, great to hear from you. Saying yes. I see you live. Nobody inspired me more than you. I'm a minimalist from Germany. Thank you so much. I appreciate your positive feedback. I always love hearing from you in our videos. And I know it's quite late in Germany right now, so thank you for tuning in with us. And I started a small collection and showed on my YouTube channel based on pop cultural impact. And I think that's great. If you know, go check out Daniel's channel for that pop cultural impact, because I love me some good pop cultural impact for sure. Okay, Victor Perez, welcome. The iconic cover of Action Comics where Superman smashing a car into rocks. Yes, and that was Action Comics #1, and that was just a seminal issue. And that cover's actually been swiped time and time again. I've seen that like a homage cover to that so many times. It's just probably the most famous cover in all the history of comic books. It's an amazing cover. And why? It's just not just because of the pop cultural impact, but in a way, Superman is the progenitor of all superheroes. All superheroes that we know today are in some way or another from Superman. You know, superhero is kind of that umbrella term, and everyone thinks Superman, even if you're not a big fan of Superman. I know I myself am not a huge fan of Superman, but yeah, it was brutal. Hey, Adrian Bedingfield, welcome, and Warlord, welcome. Are you saying the cover? Are you saying the cover was brutal? Yeah, yeah, it's not the greatest art. I mean, definitely artists nowadays are more capable, but yeah. So anyway, getting back to the early superheroes. So Superman was that first superhero, and he was very popular. And naturally, DC Comics wanted another character to sell as well as Superman. So not too long after, you see Batman hit the stands, and Batman first made his appearance in Detective Comics 27. Once again, I know I've already talked about this. We had Athena Finger on the show a few weeks ago, and Athena Finger is the granddaughter of the co-creator of Batman, and that was Bill Finger. I would really encourage you to check out that live stream that we did a few weeks ago. Very interesting. It was just great. So definitely check it out. Batman's history is not what you think it is. There was a whole dirty secret history behind the creation of Batman. So definitely. So yeah. So we get Batman, and Christopher Johnson is rolling in, and Brian Daniel. Thank you so much for your $5 super chat. It's always appreciated. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Love to hear what some of your favorite books are from the Golden Age, if you're into the Golden Age. So thank you. And that reminds me, if you'd like to help support the channel, feel free to send a super chat tonight. Any donations are always appreciated. So we have Superman, we have Batman. These two characters are now on the newsstands, and they're very popular. Well, Superman and Batman, then get a whole lot of company, whole lot. The late 1930s, early 1940s, the stands were just full of superheroes, and actually a lot of them probably didn't survive. Like, we all know the classic heroes, right? Like Superman, Batman, Flash, Captain America, Green Lantern, right? These are all characters that appeared in the golden age of comics, and they've lasted all the way to today. Now, mind you, some of these heroes, they had issues in the past too. Like, they haven't run straight through since the 1930s. They've had pauses, they've been canceled, with the exception obviously of Superman and Batman. But yeah, it's just incredible how many superheroes flooded the stands afterwards, and one of them being Captain Marvel, who at the time was from Fawcett Comics, and we now know him as Shazam because DC eventually ended up getting the rights to the original Captain Marvel, because there was this huge lawsuit between DC and Fawcett Publications, because DC felt that Captain Marvel was a little bit too similar to Superman. So there was this big copyright thing that I don't want to get into the politics of it. But what you need to know is that DC ended up getting the rights to Captain Marvel, and they then changed the name to Shazam, and we just had a Shazam movie not too long ago. So really interesting. So let's see here. Eric, no guest, still better than that guy you had on your second show. No, that guy that we had on the second show was very, very awesome. And I'm actually glad you're here, Eric, because Eric was actually our guest on the second show that we had. And Eric is also quite the comic historian himself. So really happy that you showed up tonight. Would really love to hear some of your input. So now we have all these superheroes on the stands in 1930s America, even a little bit in Canada, but Canada kind of had its own comic book industry at the time, because I think due to the war effort, I think the Canadian government at the time was actually had stopped the import of any periodical publications that were coming into the country, and I think that had to do with paper and the paper drive. So Canada kind of ended up starting its own kind of industry at the time. The only reason why I'm mentioning Canada right now is because I'm Canadian. So so we have all these superheroes on the stands, and what ends up happening is right before the war, America enters the war, the superheroes start going to war for the Allies. It's incredible. Like, every single issue dealt with the war effort. So it was just like pounding, like Nazis, the Japanese, like the covers. And I think the most famous cover from this era was definitely Captain America Comics #1, which I'm sure you've all seen it, and that is the cover where Captain America has a nice right cross to the face of Adolf Hitler. So really powerful cover there. Let's see here. Wow, okay, I'm loving all your comments here right now. Thank you so much. Marcus, let's see. So is there a platinum age of comics? Yes, there is a platinum age in comics. That was around the 1800s, the later 1800s. I actually haven't seen, believe it or not, I don't know a lot about this era, but there were like comics that existed at the time. This is like pretty much the birth of the medium, but comic books as a medium didn't really take off until the later 1930s. Yeah, those Nazi covers are really wild. It's actually really interesting to see also how these characters are drawn, how the Nazis and the Japs were drawn. Like, the Nazis were always like, they looked really sickly and like kind of, they looked really villainous, and the Japanese, they looked they really buck-toothed. They had like these fangs. It was just obviously that kind of stuff would not kind of fly today. But at the time, that was the way of thinking. World War II was a good war. Everyone thought it was a just war. It needed to happen. So everybody was doing something for the war effort at the time, including comic book creators. And it's actually really kind of ironic that all these comic books were dealing with all these superheroes knocking out the Nazis, because if you know a little bit about comic book history, you'll know that most of the people doing the books at the time were either of Jewish origin, Jewish descent, or Italian American descent. So, just considering that World War II history of the Holocaust, so on and so forth, it's really, really interesting to see how a lot of these Jewish creators were, putting forward their 2 cents in the war effort as well. The platinum. Okay, here we go. The platinum books I have seen are not glossy, more like books and oversized. Yeah, I think they kind of look almost like storybooks. I think from the few that I've seen, I think they kind of look like storybooks, kind of more like I think the only person who really does those types of style books anymore, Frank Miller, like 300 and the God Awful Holy Terror. But yeah, I'm pretty sure you are right. Let's see here. The Golden Age and before seems like it had more diversity for genres than most eras of comics. Yes, you are totally, totally right. The Golden Age had literally, you think of it, they had a comic book about it. They had humor, they had crime, they had romance, they had superhero. I think the Funny Animals, that was another one. I think the stands were mostly at this time anyway, were flooded with superheroes, especially during the war. People really wanted to, and I'm going to get to this comment in a second, but I think people who weren't able to contribute to the war effort felt like they were really doing something by reading these Golden Age books that featured superheroes just pounding the hell out of Nazis and the Japs, right? So it really made them feel good. It made them feel like, hey, yeah, we are kicking butt. It's not just our soldiers, but our heroes and all of our fictional heroes are also contributing to the war effort. It was just a really an era of solidarity. It's the best way I can put it. Eric Breen says the Adventures of Obadiah Oldbuck, published in 1837, is now considered the first comic book. Engeltine, another YouTuber, did a video. Okay, perfect. Yeah, Eric, you did mention Engeltine before, but I actually did not know about the Adventures of Obadiah Oldbuck. So I'm gonna have to check that out, because that's one era of comic books that I never really looked into that much. So I definitely will check it out and get back to you with any information that I find. But this is invaluable information. Thank you for sharing that. Oh, here we go, and we have Sportfreund. I don't speak German. I'm sorry. Sportfreund Schindler. Hi, I'm German, and I just read the word Nazi. I really have just turned on the stream, and I don't know what this is about. Oh, sorry. For those of you that are just joining us, we're talking about the history of comic books, and we're talking about comic books from when the comic book medium first started all the way to present day. So we're currently talking about comic books in the Golden Age, and in the Golden Age of comics, which was from 1938 all the way to the 50s, superheroes were always depicted fighting who were America's enemies during the war, and that was the Nazis and the Japanese. So that's why you're hearing the word Nazi right now. This is not a political stream whatsoever, so do not be afraid. So now the war ends, 1945, war ends, and the end of the war pretty much coincided with a huge hit for superheroes. I would really love to hear everyone's input on why they thought superheroes declined after the war. just kind of give you guys a few minutes here. Here we go. Check out Engeltine on I Love Comics and Old Man Comics after you've watched all of Dante's videos, of course. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Let's see. And Samuel David, welcome. Saying hello to everyone. Let's see, Christopher. Okay, perfect. Thanks, Adrian, for clarifying that. Sergeant Fury and Sergeant Rock had a great art and stories pitting them against the Nazis. Okay. Okay, and Mark Littlewood, this is actually a good question. We are going to get to that a little bit later on the stream. Now that I'm thinking, this is a topic that I think I might have to we might have to do 2 episodes on, because we're already half hour in. We haven't even gotten past the golden age, but I'm happy. I'm happy about this because I love having these conversations with you all on comic book history. I'm a comic book history dork. Sometimes I will read books on comic book history as opposed to comic books themselves. So Mark is asking, when did collecting really become a thing? In the golden age, millions of comics were sold, but they were thrown away like newspapers. No, yes, you are totally right. And that is why comic book collecting became a thing in the 1930s. You got to think, TVs, your only form of entertainment in the 1930s, this was in the Depression era, of course. Your only form of entertainment was if you had a radio, if you were fortunate enough to have a radio, and comic books and pulps. So you either read or you listened to the radio. So people would buy up comic books. It was perfect time for comic book publishers because kids really had nothing else to do besides listen to the radio, play outside, play baseball, whatever, and read comic books. So what happened was these kids would have them. They would have these comic books. They would collect them. They would trade them, because back in the day, it was actually interesting. People didn't buy comic books like they do today. So today people go to the comic book store and they will buy issue after issue after issue. They'll buy Amazing Spider-Man, whatever, 732, 33, 34, 35, whatever, wherever they're at right now. I don't even know. But back in the day, kids would go to a mom and pop shop, a corner store, a newsstand, and they would buy whatever was there. So these vendors, these news vendors, just because they had, say, Detective Comics number 43 does not mean that the next month they would have Detective Comics 44. They would just be buying from and stocking whatever they had. So the way kids would read these issues is they would buy a few, they would have like a stack, and they would trade them with their friends. It's actually really interesting. Denny O'Neil, I'm a huge fan of him, and I've listened to so many interviews with him. He would tell stories about how the way he would read comic books is he would go to the store. He would only have money, back in the time. At the time, he'd only have money to buy maybe like 1-2 comic books, something like that. And eventually, as the stack grew, he would go around. He'd have this little red wagon where he'd have all his comic books, and he'd go around the neighborhood, and he would go around the neighborhood trading with other kids. So he would get all new stories to read and to keep him occupied. So kids would have these, and they would essentially trade them like collectible cards, like baseball cards. And after a while, they would just kind of stay in these kids' rooms, and mom eventually would throw them out. But at the time, mom was throwing them out for a good reason, not just because they were accumulating in the bedroom, but because the war effort. There were paper drives during World War II, and you would actually see advertisements in these comic books from the Golden Age saying, hey, recycle this comic, donate it to a paper drive. Like, this comic book is a weapon of war. And what they were doing with this paper is they were recycling it to print war propaganda on it. So literally at the time, everything was being used. And because all of these comic books were getting tossed and donated to paper drives, so few of them remained, making them rare. Then these people that grew up during that era maybe got nostalgic, tried to track these down. And when the demand is high, but the supply is low, that's when the prices for these books really skyrocket. But we'll get into that a little bit more. So I think I had asked a little bit earlier that why comic books were hit after the war. Awesome responses here. James RFB welcome says, comics also took a hit after the war due to the seduction of the innocent, of course, and we were going to talk about that. Let's see. But imagine after World War II ended, so did all the villains. Life after 1945. Yeah, exactly. Brian, I think you hit the nail on the head there. After 1945, people didn't need heroes anymore. The villains, who were at the time the Nazis and the Japanese, the villains were defeated. People didn't want to read about these heroes saving people anymore. The people had felt saved. They had felt saved by their country, by their GIs that served abroad. So after the war, they were looking for other genres to keep them occupied. And just before I get to that, I just wanted to mention another fun fact. GIs serving abroad in Europe during the war actually had access to comic books. They loved comic books. So they would receive care packages from America, and they would have, like, cigarettes, chocolates, and of course comic books. And they loved them because, they really felt appreciated when they read these stories. So yeah, anyway, here we go. My dad was born in 1947. It was all Westerns and Daffy Duck. Yeah, for sure. So after the war, these kids that were growing up in 1945 through the 1950s, they were exposed to these other genres. We got Westerns, funny animals like Daffy Duck. We had teenage dramas, actually, like Archie. You had romances and crime, and of course horror. And this is where things really start to go awry for the comic book industry. Let's see here. Let's see. Did the U.S. some feelings of fault for Hiroshima? I can't speak just because I was a little bit before my time, but I'm sure the only thing I could say about this is I actually majored in history in my undergraduate years, and I remember reading about when they dropped the bomb, and after it was dropped, the people who dropped it, they said, like, my God, what have we done? So I think there was a little bit of regret there for sure. Okay, welcome to the code. Yes, that is exactly what I'm going to. So we now have all these genres. Crime and horror become especially popular at this time. Now, this wasn't just in comic books. The precursors to comic books were pulp magazines. So you had a lot of crime and horror pulp magazines that were really popular. You also had these radio shows, these old horror radio shows. And if you go on YouTube, you actually can search some of these radio shows, and they really, really remind me of the Tales from the Crypt stories. Some of the great ones are Inner Sanctum, Lights Out. And actually, if you watch interviews with Al Feldstein and William Gaines, who were the big players in EC Comics, who pretty much started Tales from the Crypt and all those crime comics, they said they based Tales from the Crypt and a lot of their crime and horror books off of these radio shows, because they remembered them from when they were kids, and they thought they were just so spooky. So really, really awesome. And I really definitely want to do an episode all about EC Comics around Halloween time. And I think everybody's really getting excited for Halloween here. Oh, this might get creepy. Yeah, it will, but I won't make it too creepy. So yeah. We have these horror comic books. We have these crime comic books, and William Gaines, he had to take over EC Comics, which was a comic book company at the time. It was run by Maxwell Gaines. That was his dad. And Maxwell Gaines was publishing like these books that no one really. It was actually, EC Comics originally stood for educational comics, and they sold, like, comic book Bible, comic book adaptations of Bible stories and things like that. So things that kids at the time probably didn't really want to read. But suddenly Maxwell Gaines tragically passed away, and now William Gaines had to take over. He didn't really want to, but he had these great ideas, and eventually we got Tales from the Crypt. We got The Vault of Horror, The Haunt of Fear, crime suspense stories, shock suspense stories. These were the most popular books of the 1950s. Although Tales from the Crypt never did surpass Superman, any of the Superman books in sales, they were up there. Like, everybody read EC comic books during the 1950s. And things got really, really fiercely competitive in the 1950s because other publishers now saw the success that EC Comics was having, and they wanted to replicate that success. So they then started their own line of horror comic books. Well, EC then didn't want anybody to surpass them. So then their content became gruesome, and then it became this kind of game of publishers trying to one up each other to see who could be more shocking, more gruesome with their stories. And by today's standards, these stories are definitely not out of hand whatsoever. But for the time, even some of the writers and the artists from the time, like Jack Davis, he was saying, like, yeah, I think it did get a little out of hand at the time. And this eventually caught the eye of the infamous Frederick Wertham. I wonder if everyone here has heard of Frederick Wertham. Let's see here. What do you think of the art on horror comic books? Where they're a bit tougher art than others, or do I think that just because scenes were okay? The art on horror comic books, I actually really liked it. Very, very distinct styles. I find during the Golden Age, the styles didn't every artist had their own style, obviously, but I feel that the styles didn't vary as much as they would say today. For the time, I find the styles at the time were just really in the horror comic books were really different. I could tell Johnny Craig's work from Ghastly's. I could tell Ghastly's work from Jack Davis, like Al Feldstein's work from some of those other guys. Like, very distinct. Like Johnny Craig's characters, they all had these like sweating problems. Like, you see these early these Tales from the Crypt comics, and all of Johnny Craig's characters have to like these sweating problems. It's hilarious, actually, in a way. Yeah, so overall, yeah, I do like the art in the books, and I don't know, I don't think the art was that gruesome, but again, this is coming from a guy who's living in 2020 now, not from a guy that grew up in 1950, right? So a guy's opinion in 1950 is going to be much different than mine, obviously. So but yeah, so now these comic books, let's see here, I really like this here. EC Comics had morality in their stories. Most of the other publishers were more about shock and gore. Absolutely. Excellent point, Eric. And that's the thing. I think a lot of people that were reading these books at the time were really missing the point of some of these EC stories, because all of the EC stories, it's really, the thing I love about EC is the books are and the stories are very formulaic, okay? So you have a character, they're trying to do something bad, and then eventually at the ending, you get this just desserts ending where the character gets their comeuppance, right? They're very, very interesting, and you know what's going to happen, but the stories never get old. They're great. You really just want to see how this person is going to get what's coming to them. And every single story had a morality tale, some sort of moral to it. And this was especially true of the EC line of books called shock suspense stories. And I love the shock suspense stories. They deal with a lot of issues and social issues at the time, which people did not talk about. They dealt with issues of, for example, racism, even way before the civil rights movements of the 1960s. Like, I find that Al Feldstein, William Gaines, like these like white guys. Now, Al Feldstein was Jewish, but these like white guys, yeah, they were leftist, but these guys were the pioneers of civil rights, really, in a way, with a lot of their the content that they included in their books. I'm thinking, I have all these stories like right now that are running through my mind. Like, there's this one story where this one guy, he's super racist against Jewish people, and he's part of this hate group that hates all Jewish people, and they end up killing this Jewish guy, and the mother's so ashamed of him, and she says, "You know what? I forgot to tell you, you're adopted and you're actually Jewish." Which, it was like, whoa, what's going on here? And then there was another story where there were these two soldiers that served abroad. One of them was white, one of them was black. The black soldier died in the war, and when they came back, they didn't want to give the black soldier the same type of burial and treatment as the white soldiers that passed away. And the soldiers, like, I'm disgusted. Like, what the heck am I fighting for? So just amazing stories at the time. And that's the thing. So Eric, you're totally right. All the other publishers didn't get the point. They were just trying to one up EC, but EC's quality was always there. Like, they always had the really high quality stories. So yeah, yes, he was totally, Superman totally was leftist in his early stories. It's really funny, and nowadays people hate talking about politics and comic books because it's very much front and center. Yeah, here come the politics. I'll promise I won't keep it too political, but comic books were always political. They just weren't in your face like some of the comics today, but they always were political. They always had some sort of leftist. Most of them had like this kind of leftist. How can I put it? Like a leftist agenda, I guess, but it wasn't like so much in your face. They always kind of preached for the good of the common man type of thing. So yeah. Now, all these books are being published. They're getting violent. Yes, they do. North Star, I think North Star was the first gay wedding in a comic book. North Star, and remind me who he married. I don't remember who North Star married. Actually, yeah, I have to say that those old Superman stories are pretty. I don't read them for pleasure. I read them more for academic interest. I would have to say. And thank you, Brian. I really appreciate it. I try to educate people on comic book history all the time because it's really awesome. So moving on, yes, these publishers are now all publishing this content that has a lot of gore, and interviewed some kids that were at a juvie, and what he found is that most of these kids read comic books. So he started taking a look at some of these comic books, and what he found was a lot of violence, and he thought that comic books were the reason that these kids were delinquents. But the thing that it's just really funny if you actually read some of the passages from Seduction of the Innocent. For a guy who had a doctorate, his logic was pretty flawed. The thing is, okay, most of these kids at the time in juvie were reading comic books, but something like 90%, like over 90% of boys, you're talking like 96% of boys and 92% of girls read comic books at the time. What else were they going to do? 1950s America? Not everybody had TVs yet. So these kids, again, had to resort to reading. And if you want to know where I'm getting my stats, check out Bradford Wright's Comic Book Nation. It is an academic look at comic book history. It's really, really great book. I highly recommend the read. But in that book, he talks about how over 90% of boys and girls at the time read comic books. So he's reading all these books, and he's saying, like, this is like it's fantasy, and it's wish fulfillment, and these kids are learning all this violence from this, which isn't true. I think one of the things that kind of contributed to juvenile delinquency at the time, actually, there were many things that contributed to it at the time. So you had a lot of families that were broken by the war. So you have kids now growing up in these types of families that were broken because of the war. And then you also had this population increase, because remember, at the time, you have the baby boom that happened right after World War II. So 1945, all the soldiers get back, and they haven't seen their missus in a while, and everybody's getting jiggy and having babies. So now there are all these kids running around, and the population really increased. So when you have an increase in population, well, of course, you're going to have some bad apples in that in that lot. So of course, juvenile delinquency would up. Well, yeah, people listened to Frederick Wortham. He had a doctor in front of his name, and people listened to him. So it's actually incredible how, like, America then had a crusade against comic books. The Senate subcommittee actually even had a hearing on the effects of comic books on young minds, and William Gaines actually testified at this hearing. You actually can find the clip on YouTube if you want. But yeah, it's just it's absolutely unbelievable. They had comic book burnings. It was just horrible what was going on. Like, so of course sales took a plummet. They just went, and the company that got affected the most, obviously, was EC Comics, to the point where EC Comics ceased publication of all of the books that they are known for. The only reason why the company stayed afloat afterwards is because they had Mad Magazine that carried them through the years. Mad Magazine actually started off as a comic book, and then it just kind of, because of all this crap that was going on with Seduction of the Innocent, they just converted it to more of magazine format, and that's how they stayed afloat. But this was not a good time for comic book publishers. So many comic book publishers, so many comic book creators lost their jobs during this time, and it was just it was not a good time to be in comic books. This is when comic books became the dirty little secret that you hid from your parents. You read at night with a flashlight and a blanket over your head, because if you got caught, you might get in trouble. It became that bad. Let's see here. I got some other interesting comments here. Yeah, right. Like, I agree. Comic book burning seems so surreal. Actually, it was really interesting. I think it was Denny O'Neil was really good friends with. I'm picturing him, but I can't get his name out. He's another big name. If you know who Denny O'Neil was really good friends with, please let me know in the comments right now. But he was he was good friends with another huge comic book guy, and this guy actually went to one of these comic book burnings with his mom. And it's funny because right before they set all these comic books on fire, he found a few that kind of interested him in the pile, and he took some and he stuffed them in his pockets. So yeah, I thought that was great. No, it wasn't Neil Adams. Crap. This is actually who got Denny O'Neil, and it wasn't Dick Giordano. It was actually who got Denny O'Neil into comic books. Roy Thomas. That's who it was. It was Roy Thomas. It just came to me now. Roy Thomas got Denny O'Neil into comic books, and Roy Thomas was the one who went to these comic book burnings, and he saw some that he liked, and he just stuffed them in his pockets, right? So I thought that was great when I learned about that. But anyway, yeah. So comic books took a hit. it got to a point where the stories became really tame because the publishers, the industry essentially bent over for the American public, or sorry, the comic book industry, bent over for the American public, and the stories were really, really tame because now you have the Comics Code Authority. The Comics Code Authority is what kind of emerged from this whole debacle with Frederick Wertham. And this was a self-governing body that would put this seal of approval on all the comic books before they were published. So some of these comic books at the time were not able to get this seal if there was a list of rules, like to the point where you almost couldn't write about anything. And that's why the stories became so boring. Now, could you publish without that seal? Yeah, you could. You definitely could publish without that seal, but no one would buy your books because parents were now really watching what their kids were buying at the corner store, right? So, that seal was necessary at the time. Now, in order to get this seal, these publishers were just pumping out these really boring, bland morality tales. Stan Lee said Stanley absolutely hated working during this time because he was just he said he would take a sound like, and he would try to make a word out of it and name a monster for that week because like they didn't even know what to write about. The one good thing that came out of the code was that it prompted Julius Schwartz to try superhero comics again with the Flash showcase in number 4. Yes, you are totally right. And we're going to get to that for sure, Eric. You're totally right. The code actually indirectly brought superheroes back, believe it or not. Now, did superheroes survive during the 1950s? Well, yes, they did. They actually did survive. But for those of you that have 1950s comic books, superhero comics in your collections, you'll know that they're not the greatest reads. They're not the funnest or most fun reads ever. So like, for example, you would have, like, this is what would happen in a comic book. And it's great because I heard George Martin say this in an interview, George R.R. Martin, the author of Game of Thrones. He said that, a typical comic book from the 1950s was like Superboy saving the school picnic by, toasting all the hot dogs, making them nice and toasty with his heat vision, or Superman, saving this old woman from having to eat cold porridge. So he would like zap her porridge with his heat vision. Like, they're just the most ridiculous things. And a lot of historians said that it's really interesting because this era really mirrored the Eisenhower era. This was the Eisenhower era of American history. And, they always say the Eisenhower era was the most bland era, one of the most like blandest eras in American history. And this was definitely a very bland era in comic books as well. It's so interesting because the social consciousness at a particular point in time very much dictates the content in comic books. And that's why I love comic books. For people that think they're just unintelligent stories that only unintelligent people, illiterate people read, I think that's total hogwash, because I think if you really look at comic books, they're a very intelligent medium, because they are basically telling you, like, you can learn about any period in history by reading the comic books from that point in time. That's actually how I got interested in history, is by reading some of these old comic books or these old stories, and wondering, like, I wonder what prompted these types of stories. Adrian, I totally agree. That's probably a topic for another another stream for sure. George R. Martin definitely needs to finish Winds of Winter. I don't know if he's ever going to finish it. If he does finish it, honestly, that thing is going to be thicker than the Bible. Like that, it's going to be huge. But yeah, for sure. Yeah. So these comic books, you know. Oh, I think this is another conversation that's going on. Yeah, for sure. Like I said, comic books are a very intelligent medium. So now you have these superheroes that are trying, and I'm going to go for 5 more minutes. I'm realizing that this is going to have to be a series now. We're going to have to dedicate an episode, I think, to each era of comic books. So this week is going to be the Golden Age, and next week is going to have to be the Silver Age for sure. So with the last 5 minutes, I'm going to talk about that transition we had to the Silver Age. So we have all these superheroes, bland stories. Some of them were actually, almost canceled. Like Batman was almost canceled at the time. Like Batman books from the time, mostly dealing with aliens. A lot of aliens in the Batman books. Superman books, Superman became this upstanding citizen, and Batman became this father figure. It wasn't. Most people watching tonight probably would not enjoy the content, the superhero content from the 1950s for sure. It was just not great. But that being said, like Eric said a little while ago, the editor of DC at the time in the late 1950s, his name was Julius Schwartz. Okay. Brilliant man, very, very intelligent man. One of the most legendary publishers of DC ever in history. Yes, Jesse, the Batman alien covers are pretty cool. They definitely are. I would agree. 1950s actually was a great time. If you're into sci-fi, the 1950s was a great time for sci-fi comics for sure. UFOs were very much in the American consciousness. This is when the United States built Area 51. All these experiments were going on because the Americans were now in a Cold War with the Russians. And all these experiments, with things in the sky were now prompting all of these theories about UFOs and it's really, really, really interesting. That's an interesting point in time. How all this sci-fi and alien content came to be, right? So for sure, those covers were cool. I definitely would agree with you, Jesse, for sure. So yes, Christopher, you are totally right. Seduction of the innocent prompted the creation of Batwoman. I believe you are totally right about that, and it's because Frederick Wortham famously said that Batman and Robin were homosexuals just by how much time they spend together. He also he had a sample panel of Bruce Wayne and Dick Grayson waking up side by side in a bed or something like that. It was ridiculous. So now Batman and Robin are gay, which this is something that the publishers still make fun of nowadays. They still kind of throw that in there every so often. But yeah, so now because the stereotype was that Batman and Robin were gay, they started spending a lot more time with women, because obviously homosexuality was something that was not accepted back then. So Batman and Robin started spending a heck of a lot more time with girls, and Batwoman definitely was a product of that for sure. Yeah, so now we have Julius Schwartz. Sorry, my throat's getting a little dry. Been talking for almost an hour straight. So we have Julius Schwartz. He's now he's the publisher of DC, and he decides he doesn't know what to do anymore. He kind of wants to shake things up, right? So he decides to give some of these older heroes from the Golden Age a shot again, because they were running out of content to work with, right? So they decided, hey, let's let's bring some of these old heroes back, like, Green Lantern, the Flash. These are all characters that were canceled after the war because, people didn't want to read about superheroes anymore. The only heroes that survived post-war were Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman. Obviously, Robin too. So, so now Julius Schwartz wants to give these heroes a try. And in Showcase number 4, famous Flash cover from 1958, new era in comic books happens. That officially, by comic book historians and comic book collectors all over the world, it is agreed that Showcase number 4 is the official beginning of the Silver Age. And that is where we are going to pick up next week in, I guess, this new series. I really meant to talk about all of comic book history in this video, but looks like we just got around to getting through the Golden Age. But that's okay. Like I said, I'm really excited because now I get to talk about comic book history even more in a lot more videos about comic book history. And I have to say, all of these comments have just been awesome. Thank you so much to all of you for popping by for this stream. The turnout was great. I think we had almost 30 people watching at one point, and it was just great to hear from all of you because honestly, I could tell that we have a lot of people that are interested in comic book history on this channel. We have a lot of comic book historians on this channel. So thank you for turning out or for coming out and giving me some of your input. Really enjoy this opportunity to interact with you all on a more personal basis. Because like I said, I love having guests, but it can be hard to, get around to comments. Christopher, you're welcome for the live streams. Definitely enjoy doing them. And I definitely love talking to you all. I wish you all, it is Friday. It's Friday, geeks. Let's all get out there, have some fun, have a great weekend. And I want you all to stay tuned and look out for the new video that will be posted on Monday. Until next time, this is Dante D signing off. I will see you all in the next episode. Take care. Have a great weekend.